Good evening and welcome. In this story, we will explore Vlad the Impaler, the prince who ruled through fear, and uncover how a boy born between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe grew into one of the most feared rulers of the 15th century, transforming terror into a weapon and carving his name so deeply into history that it would echo for centuries as legend, myth, and eventually Dracula. This is not simply a tale of cruelty. It is a story of hostagehood and betrayal, of a throne built on instability, of a man who believed that fear was the only shield strong enough to protect a fragile kingdom. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Now settle in, take a slow breath, and step into the borderlands of Wallachia. In the winter of 1431, in the small Transylvanian town of Siasora, beneath the shadow of thick stone walls and watchtowers that had seen generations of merchants, soldiers, and shifting allegiances, a child was born into a world that did not permit innocence to last long. His name was Vlad, son of Vlad II Dracula, and though no one present at his birth could have foreseen the legend that would grow around him, the circumstances of his arrival already carried the tension of empires pressing against one another like tectonic plates preparing to shift. Wallachia, the principality his family ruled, was not an empire but a corridor, a narrow and vulnerable strip of land caught between the expanding power of the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north. And in such corridors, survival depends not on strength alone, but on constant negotiation, on calculated loyalty, on knowing when to kneel and when to resist. To be born into its ruling family was not to inherit comfort, it was to inherit pressure. His father, Vlad II, had recently been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric society founded to defend Christianity against the advance of the Ottoman Turks. And from this association he adopted the name Dracula, meaning dragon, though in the evolving language of the region it also carried the darker echo of devil, and thus the boy became known as Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon, a name that would, in time, take on meanings far beyond its original intent. But at the moment of his birth, there was no monster, no impaler, no whisper of forests of stakes. There was only a child born into a borderland. To understand Vlad's life, one must first understand the geography that shaped him. Because Wallachia was less a kingdom of stable identity and more a political fault line, where rulers rarely died peacefully and loyalty could become treason within a single season. Its princes, called voivodes, balanced tribute payments to the Ottomans with alliances to Hungary, maneuvering constantly to avoid invasion from either side, and in this delicate dance survival required both adaptability and ruthlessness. Vlad's early years were marked not by fairy tale security, but by uncertainty woven into daily existence. His father, though aligned with the Order of the Dragon, was forced to acknowledge Ottoman supremacy at times, paying tribute and sending assurances of loyalty southward, while simultaneously reassuring Hungary that Wallachia remained within the Christian sphere. This was not hypocrisy, it was strategy born of necessity. A small state surrounded by giants does not have the luxury of purity. In 1442, when Vlad was still a boy, this strategy reached a breaking point. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II summoned Vlad II Dracula to his court, demanding proof of loyalty, and in the language of medieval politics, proof often came in the form of hostages. Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken to the Ottoman court, not as honored guests but as living guarantees of their father's compliance, and it was here, far from Wallachia's forests and hills, that Vlad's formative years unfolded. To be a hostage in the Ottoman court was not to be chained in a dungeon. It was more insidious than that. The princes were educated alongside other noble youths, trained in language, military tactics, courtly behavior, and Islamic culture, exposed to the immense machinery of a rising empire that was organized, disciplined, and formidable. They were treated well enough to prevent resentment from turning into immediate rebellion, yet always reminded that their lives depended upon their father's obedience. For a boy who had been born into fragile sovereignty, this experience must have carved something deep into his psyche. He witnessed firsthand the scale of Ottoman power, the disciplined Janissary corps, the hierarchy, the certainty with which commands were executed, and in contrast he must have sensed the vulnerability of Wallachia's constantly shifting loyalties. In the Ottoman capital, power was centralized and undeniable. In his homeland, it was negotiated and fragile. His younger brother Radu adapted more easily to this environment. Historical accounts suggest that Radu became close to the Ottoman court, perhaps even to the future Sultan Mehmed II, absorbing the culture with less visible resistance, while Vlad remained more distant, more rigid, observing without surrendering inwardly. Whether this distinction is entirely accurate or partly shaped by later narratives, the contrast between the brothers would become a defining fracture in the years ahead. Hostagehood is a peculiar form of trauma. It does not necessarily leave visible scars, but it implants a constant awareness that one's existence is conditional, that survival depends upon forces beyond one's control. And for a boy born into rulership, this awareness is particularly corrosive. Authority, which should have been his inheritance, became instead something demonstrated by others over him. Meanwhile, events in Wallachia spiraled. Vlad II Dracula's position grew unstable as factions within the nobility. The boyars shifted allegiance between Hungary and the Ottomans, and in 1447 his father was assassinated, his elder brother Mircea reportedly buried alive after being blinded, and the throne seized by rivals. The news would have reached Vlad in Ottoman territory not as abstract politics but as personal catastrophe. Imagine the psychological collision. A young prince, held as insurance by the empire his father had tried to appease, learning that appeasement had not saved his family, that political maneuvering had ended in betrayal and death, and that he was now both hostage and heir to a throne soaked in blood. It is here, perhaps, that the first seeds of obsession were planted: control, retribution. Uncertainty resolved through force. When Vlad was briefly released and supported by the Ottomans in an attempt to claim the Wallachian throne in 1448, his rule lasted mere months before he was driven out again, another lesson in the instability of power in his homeland. Thrones were not secured by lineage alone, they were held by strength, by fear, by elimination of rivals before rivals eliminated you. Exile followed. These were years not of passive wandering, but of observation and calculation. Vlad sought support first from the Ottomans, then from Hungary, navigating the same geopolitical currents that had consumed his father, yet with one crucial difference. He had seen what dependency looked like from inside the Ottoman court, and he had seen what internal betrayal could do within Wallachia. The boy born between empires was becoming a man defined by them. He understood now that mercy in a fractured principality might be interpreted as weakness, that boyars who shifted loyalty once would shift it again, that survival required more than negotiation. It required dominance so unmistakable that betrayal seemed suicidal. This was not yet the Vlad who would impale thousands, not yet the figure who would terrify diplomats and merchants alike, but the architecture of his future rule was already under construction, brick by psychological brick, laid upon foundations of hostagehood, betrayal, and exile. He had witnessed centralized power in the Ottoman Empire. He had experienced the volatility of Wallachian politics. He had lost father and brother to internal treachery. He had seen loyalty bought and sold like grain. From these experiences, a conclusion could easily form. Order must be imposed, not requested. When he would later seize the throne decisively in 1456, he would do so not as an idealist seeking harmony, but as a ruler determined to eradicate instability at its root, to make examples so extreme that memory itself would enforce obedience. But that is yet to come. For now, in this first chapter of his life, what matters is the tension into which he was born, a tension between Christianity and Islam, between Hungary and the Ottomans, between noble factions and princely authority, between survival and sovereignty, and how that tension shaped a mind that would later choose fear as its primary instrument. A child born into peace might grow into moderation. A child born into constant political hostagehood may grow into something else entirely. Vlad did not choose the corridor between empires. He was born into it. And in that corridor, where compromise often meant humiliation and hesitation often meant death, a particular kind of ruler was forged, one who would decide that if Wallachia were to survive, it would not be through balance alone, but through terror so vivid that enemies hesitated before crossing its borders. The boy in Sayasora could not yet know the forests of stakes that would define his name, nor the pamphlets that would paint him as monster, nor the centuries that would twist his memory into vampire myth, but he was already learning the lesson that would govern his reign. In a land where power is constantly contested, fear can become the only stable currency. If birth between empires planted the conditions of Vlad's future severity, then the years spent as a hostage within the Ottoman sphere hardened those conditions into something far more deliberate, because childhood, when shaped by uncertainty and suspended autonomy, does not merely pass through a person. It engraves itself into the reflexes of their adulthood, teaching them what the world is long before they have the power to influence it. When Vlad and his younger brother Radu were delivered to the Ottoman court in 1442, the transaction was political, almost clinical in its logic. Their father, Vlad II Dracula, had wavered in his loyalties, attempting to balance Hungarian expectations with Ottoman dominance, and Sultan Mehmed II required insurance that Wallachia would not tilt too far northward toward Christian resistance. The sons would remain in Ottoman custody as living guarantees that their father would not rebel recklessly. Yet what appears strategic on parchment becomes deeply personal in lived experience, and for Vlad, still an adolescent, this was not diplomacy but displacement. The Ottoman court was unlike the fractured, faction-ridden courts of Wallachia. It was vast, structured, disciplined, and above all confident in its ascendancy, because the empire was expanding with relentless momentum, absorbing territories across Anatolia and the Balkans, reorganizing administration with efficiency that smaller principalities could scarcely imagine. And when Vlad arrived, he did not enter chaos but order, an order that functioned without him and that did not bend for his princely status. Hostage princes were not thrown into chains unless they defied expectations. They were educated, observed, cultivated as potential future allies, taught languages, military science, strategy, and court etiquette. And in this environment, Vlad learned Turkish, studied Ottoman governance, and witnessed firsthand the machinery of imperial power. Yet beneath the structured civility lay the constant reminder that his life remained collateral. To live as collateral is to exist in a permanent state of conditional security. Privileges are extended, but they are not yours. Respect is shown, but it is measured. Every lesson learned is both opportunity and warning, because behind every courtesy lies the unspoken truth that disobedience from your homeland could end you swiftly. For Radu, the younger brother, the Ottoman court appears to have offered a path of adaptation. Historical sources suggest he assimilated more comfortably, perhaps even forming a close relationship with the future Sultan Mehmed II, and in time he would align himself politically with Ottoman interests. Vlad, however, seems to have responded differently, absorbing knowledge without internal surrender, observing hierarchy without fully trusting it, learning the mechanisms of control not to join them, but perhaps to one day replicate them elsewhere. The contrast between the brothers is psychologically significant because it demonstrates two divergent responses to power. One adapts and integrates, the other studies and resists internally, storing resentment as potential energy. In environments of captivity, such divergence often shapes destiny more than formal education ever could. Within the Ottoman system, Vlad would have encountered the Janissaries, elite soldiers recruited through the Devshirme system. Trained from youth in absolute loyalty to the Sultan, disciplined beyond comparison with many European forces of the time. And this model of centralized military authority, an army bound not by feudal fragmentation, but by singular command, must have left an impression on a prince whose homeland suffered from boyars constantly recalculating allegiance. In the Ottoman world, treachery was met with swift, often brutal consequence. Authority radiated outward with clarity. Rebellion was crushed decisively. Such lessons, when internalized by someone who has already experienced betrayal at home, can reshape one's understanding of governance entirely. Then came catastrophe. In 1447, while Vlad remained within Ottoman reach, Wallachian politics imploded. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was assassinated amid shifting alliances, and his elder brother Mircea was reportedly captured, blinded with hot irons, and buried alive, a punishment not merely political but symbolic, designed to erase a rival's legitimacy through public horror. News of such brutality would not have arrived gently. It would have torn through Vlad's remaining illusions about the protective value of compromise. His father had attempted balance between powers. He had attempted diplomacy. He had attempted calculated allegiance. And he had died regardless. From a psychological standpoint, this moment is pivotal. The lesson that diplomacy alone does not ensure survival, that mercy does not guarantee safety, and that rivals left breathing can one day blind and bury you alive, does not disappear once absorbed. It lingers as a framework through which future decisions are filtered. In 1448, the Ottomans released Vlad temporarily, backing his brief attempt to claim the Wallachian throne, yet his rule lasted only months before he was driven out again, another confirmation that legitimacy without overwhelming force is fragile, especially in a principality where noble factions can pivot swiftly when opportunity presents itself. This brief taste of authority, followed by immediate loss, likely intensified rather than softened his resolve. He had now experienced 3 layers of instability: hostagehood under imperial watch, familial annihilation through internal betrayal, and ephemeral rule undone by insufficient control. Each layer reinforced the same conclusion: survival depends not on trust, but on dominance so clear that opposition appears futile. It is tempting to imagine Vlad's later cruelty as spontaneous excess, as temperament unrestrained by conscience, yet when viewed through the lens of these early years, a different pattern emerges. Terror in his future reign would not be chaotic, it would be systematic. Punishments would not be hidden, they would be displayed. Violence would not be arbitrary, it would be communicative. The forest of impaled bodies that would one day greet invading armies was not born from sudden madness, but from accumulated lessons about the utility of fear in unstable environments. At the Ottoman court, Vlad saw what disciplined hierarchy could achieve. In Wallachia, he saw what fractured loyalty could destroy. Between these models, he formed his own synthesis, a vision of rulership that borrowed decisiveness from empire and applied it ruthlessly to local fragmentation. Meanwhile, Radu's path diverged further. Where Vlad's internal resistance hardened, Radu's alignment with Ottoman power grew, and this divergence would later manifest as political opposition, brother against brother, each embodying different responses to the same formative captivity. In many ways, they became living symbols of Wallachia's dilemma: submit and integrate, or resist and risk annihilation. Exile after 1448 allowed Vlad time not merely to survive, but to observe regional politics more broadly. He moved through Moldavia and Hungary, seeking support, studying the ambitions of King Matthias Corvinus, analyzing how great powers manipulated smaller states, and refining his understanding that Wallachia's weakness lay not only in external pressure, but in internal disunity. By the time he prepared to reclaim the throne decisively in 1456, he was no longer merely the son of Dracula, nor merely a former hostage, but a man who had internalized the mechanics of imperial power and the consequences of insufficient control. The boy once held as insurance had become strategist, carrying within him both humiliation and instruction, both resentment and blueprint. It is in these years that the psychological architecture of Vlad the Impaler truly solidified. He did not forget the Ottoman court, he studied it. He did not forgive the boyars who shifted allegiance, he planned for them. He did not romanticize his father's diplomacy, he recalibrated it. And when opportunity arose to seize Wallachia with greater permanence, he would do so not with tentative compromise, but with calculated severity designed to prevent repetition of his family's fate. The hostage prince, then, was not merely captive, he was incubating. And the world that would soon tremble at his methods was the same world that had taught him, patiently and brutally, that in a land suspended between empires, fear can become the only reliable border. By the time Vlad emerged from his years of captivity and exile, the divide between him and his younger brother Radu was no longer simply temperamental but ideological, shaped by the same formative experience yet interpreted through entirely different psychological lenses. Because where Vlad had absorbed humiliation as a reason to harden, Radu had interpreted proximity to Ottoman power as opportunity to belong. And in that divergence lay one of the most intimate fractures of Vlad's life, the realization that loyalty itself could split along lines of survival strategy. The Ottoman court had not merely trained princes in diplomacy and warfare. It had functioned as a crucible in which identities were tested and reshaped, and for Radu, who would later be known as Radu the Handsome, assimilation offered a kind of security that Wallachia's turbulence could not. For to align with the Sultan was to align with ascendant power, to trade precarious independence for structured patronage. And though such a choice might appear submissive to those outside it, within the calculus of survival it carried its own logic. Vlad, however, had left the Ottoman sphere with a different conclusion, one forged from the trauma of watching his father attempt balance and fail, and from internalizing the fragility of rule built upon compromise. To him, submission risked gradual erasure, and assimilation meant relinquishing the volatile autonomy that defined Wallachia's existence, even if that autonomy came at the cost of constant war. The brothers thus embodied Wallachia's existential dilemma: align with overwhelming force and become extension of empire, or resist and endure perpetual instability. When Vlad briefly claimed the Wallachian throne in 1448 with Ottoman backing, he did so not from ideological conversion but from strategic necessity. Yet his expulsion soon after reinforced the lesson that without deep internal consolidation, no external support would sustain him. During the years that followed, as he sought backing from Hungary and cultivated alliances in Moldavia, Radu remained closer to the Ottoman orbit, gradually integrating into its hierarchy and earning trust within its ranks. And this gradual divergence would transform sibling tension into geopolitical opposition. The emotional dimension of this divide is difficult to measure, yet it must not be underestimated, because brothers forged together in captivity do not drift apart casually. They fracture along fault lines carved by shared trauma interpreted differently. And in Vlad's case, the knowledge that Radu not only remained within Ottoman favor but would later lead Ottoman-supported campaigns against him would have intensified his sense that compromise breeds betrayal. By 1456, when Vlad seized the Wallachian throne decisively after the death of rival ruler Vladislav II, whom he reportedly killed personally in combat, he returned not as uncertain claimant, but as man determined to eliminate instability at its source. And one of the first sources he identified was the boyar class, the noble families who had shifted allegiance repeatedly, who had conspired in his father's downfall, and who represented the internal fragmentation that made Wallachia vulnerable to both Ottoman and Hungarian manipulation. In this period, Vlad's methods began to crystallize into the pattern that would define his rule, because rather than negotiating endlessly with factions whose loyalty had proven fluid, he opted for systematic intimidation, inviting leading boyars to gatherings under pretense of reconciliation only to arrest or execute those he deemed disloyal, forcing others into labor to rebuild fortifications, and replacing entrenched elites with individuals dependent directly upon his authority. These actions were brutal, yet within his logic they were preventative, a purge designed to ensure that what had happened to his father could not recur. Radu, observing from the Ottoman sphere, would have seen these developments not merely as harsh governance, but as potential destabilization of Ottoman interests, because a Wallachia ruled by uncompromising independence threatened the Sultan's southern frontier, and thus the personal divergence between brothers merged with imperial policy, transforming familial tension into military inevitability. It is here that Vlad's worldview hardened further. The brother who once shared hostagehood now aligned with the empire that had once held them captive, and this alignment would soon manifest in open conflict, as Radu supported Ottoman campaigns against Vlad's rule. For Vlad, this was not abstract rivalry, but confirmation that loyalty divided under pressure, that blood did not guarantee allegiance, and that survival required not sentiment but clarity of command. The psychological weight of facing one's own brother as instrument of foreign power cannot be overstated, because it transforms political conflict into intimate betrayal, reinforcing the perception that mercy invites vulnerability. In a land already fractured by external pressure, the idea that even kin could embody opposing visions of survival deepened Vlad's conviction that unity must be enforced through unmistakable demonstration of consequence. Thus, when Vlad intensified his use of impalement as a form of execution, he did so not merely to punish criminals, but to broadcast a message to all potential dissenters, internal and external alike, that Wallachia under his rule would not be negotiated into submission quietly. Impalement, gruesome and prolonged, was chosen not because quicker methods were unavailable, but because spectacle communicates permanence. It engraves memory through horror, deterring rebellion by transforming punishment into landscape. Meanwhile, Radu's integration into Ottoman command structures progressed, and as Sultan Mehmed II prepared campaigns to consolidate control over rebellious territories following his conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Wallachia became both strategic necessity and symbolic challenge, and the stage was set for confrontation not only between principality and empire, but between two brothers whose childhoods had diverged into incompatible destinies. In many historical narratives, one brother becomes hero and the other villain, yet in truth they represented two rational responses to geopolitical reality. Radu embraced alignment with the dominant empire to secure influence within it. Vlad rejected subordination in favor of violent autonomy. Neither path was free of cost, yet Vlad's path demanded constant assertion through fear, because independence without overwhelming deterrence invites invasion. As rumors of his methods spread beyond Wallachia's borders, German pamphleteers and Saxon merchants began recording exaggerated accounts of his cruelty, transforming local enforcement into international horror stories. And though propaganda amplified details for political reasons, the core reality remained. Vlad had chosen terror as stabilizing principle, believing that if enemies hesitated long enough, survival might be possible. In the shadow of this intensifying reputation stood the unresolved presence of Radu, whose eventual leadership of Ottoman-backed forces against Vlad would embody the ultimate test of Vlad's philosophy. Could fear sustain sovereignty against an empire commanded by one's own brother? The answer would unfold in campaigns marked by night raids, scorched earth, and psychological warfare, but beneath those battles lay the enduring truth that Vlad's severity did not arise in isolation. It was forged in the contrast between his path and Radu's, between defiance and accommodation, between two interpretations of captivity's lesson. One brother chose integration, the other chose domination. And in that choice, the prince once held as hostage became architect of a rule that would shock Europe and imprint his name upon history not merely as ruler, but as warning. When Vlad returned to Wallachia in 1456 to claim the throne in earnest, He did not arrive as an uncertain claimant testing fragile alliances, but as a man who had rehearsed this moment internally for years, who had watched rulers rise and fall, who had seen his father betrayed and his brother murdered, and who understood that in a principality where loyalty shifted like wind across the Danube plains, a throne was not inherited. It was secured through decisive elimination of instability. The death of Vladislav II, the rival voivode whom Vlad reportedly defeated personally in combat near Targovist, was not merely a political event but a symbolic one, because in striking down a claimant backed by Hungarian interests, Vlad announced that his rule would not be an extension of foreign influence, nor would it rely on fragile compromise. It would be asserted with clarity that left little room for ambiguity. Yet claiming the throne was only the beginning, for Wallachia's greatest threat was not always external invasion but internal fragmentation. The entrenched boyar families whose power rivaled that of the prince, and whose history of shifting allegiance had already cost Vlad his father and brother. And thus the consolidation of authority required not only military victory, but surgical dismantling of aristocratic networks capable of repeating past betrayals. One of Vlad's earliest acts upon securing power was to confront these boyars directly, inviting them to gatherings under pretense of consultation or celebration, only to arrest those whose loyalty he doubted and subject them to execution or forced labor. And though such actions would later be depicted as cruelty for its own sake, within Vlad's strategic calculus they served a preventive function, to demonstrate that the era of princely vulnerability had ended. At an Easter feast in 1457, according to later accounts, he summoned leading nobles and questioned them about how many princes they had served, exposing their habitual opportunism before ordering the arrest and execution of older conspirators while sending younger ones to forced labor constructing Ponari Castle, a fortress perched high in the Carpathian Mountains that would become both refuge and symbol of his determination to fortify Wallachia against both internal and external threat. Ponari was not merely architectural ambition, it was psychological statement, rising above valleys like reminder that rulership under Vlad would be unassailable from casual intrigue, and the labor used to build it, often drawn from those whose loyalty he questioned, reinforced the message that privilege no longer insulated one from consequence. The use of impalement, which would become his signature method of punishment, began to appear with increasing frequency during this consolidation period, not randomly but with calculated visibility, because impalement achieved what swift execution could not. It transformed punishment into enduring spectacle, bodies raised upon stakes lining roads or positioned at city gates, forcing passers-by to confront the cost of disobedience long after the act itself had ended. To modern sensibilities, such cruelty appears incomprehensible. Yet in a 15th century borderland where rebellion invited annihilation from larger empires, Vlad may have believed that the horror inflicted upon a few would prevent greater catastrophe upon many, and in this moral arithmetic terror becomes tool of statecraft, deterrence embodied rather than whispered. His reforms extended beyond punishment. He sought to centralize authority, reduce the autonomy of local magnates, and impose stricter control over trade routes, especially those dominated by Saxon merchants in Transylvania whose economic independence sometimes translated into political interference. And when these merchants resisted his policies, he retaliated harshly, fueling the propaganda that would later paint him as sadistic tyrant in German pamphlets distributed across Europe. Yet within Wallachia, accounts of his rule were more complex, because alongside brutality existed enforcement of order, suppression of banditry, and efforts to create predictable governance in a region accustomed to volatility. And it is precisely this duality, cruelty intertwined with stability, that complicates his legacy. The throne he occupied was not cushioned by universal loyalty. It was surrounded by watchful neighbors, by Hungary under King Matthias Corvinus, by the Ottoman Empire under Mehmed II, and by internal factions whose patience might evaporate at any sign of weakness. And thus Vlad's consolidation period can be understood as preparation for inevitable confrontation, a tightening of internal discipline before external storm. Meanwhile, his brother Radu's position within the Ottoman sphere strengthened, and as Mehmed II turned attention toward rebellious vassals after his conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Wallachia defiance under Vlad became increasingly intolerable, particularly when Vlad refused to pay tribute and executed Ottoman envoys who demanded compliance, reportedly nailing their turbans to their heads in a grotesque statement that Wallachia would not bow. Such acts were not merely theatrical. They were declarations of independence broadcast in blood, signaling that Wallachia under Vlad would not accept gradual absorption into Ottoman structure. And though this defiance inspired some contemporaries to view him as defender of Christendom, it simultaneously ensured that retaliation would come with force. The throne built on betrayal was thus fortified not only against boyars but against empire, and every stake erected along Wallachian roads carried dual message. To internal conspirators it warned against treachery. To external powers it announced resistance without compromise. Yet fear as foundation requires constant reinforcement, because terror fades if not renewed, and Vlad's reign during these years became defined by a rhythm of enforcement, investigation, accusation, execution, designed to maintain equilibrium through intimidation. And whether this rhythm emerged from strategic calculation or from trauma-driven compulsion remains debated by historians, but its effect was undeniable. Wallachia under Vlad was quieter, more centralized, less prone to immediate aristocratic revolt. However, stability achieved through fear remains brittle when confronted by overwhelming external force, and as reports of his actions reached both Buda and Constantinople, alliances shifted, propaganda intensified, and the stage was set for direct confrontation with Mehmed II, whose patience for rebellious vassals had limits. Vlad had secured the throne. He had purged internal rivals. He had fortified strongholds. He had broadcast independence. But the very methods that secured his rule also magnified his isolation, because rulers who govern through fear often find themselves feared alone, without broad coalition to rely upon when empire advances. The throne he now occupied stood firm within Wallachia's borders, yet beyond those borders gathered forces that would test whether terror could withstand imperial momentum, and whether a prince forged in hostagehood and betrayal could sustain sovereignty through severity alone. The boy born between empires had become prince between armies, and the next chapter would reveal whether fear, so effective internally, could deter a sultan determined to reassert dominion. When Sultan Mehmed II turned his attention toward Wallachia in 1462, he did so not merely as a distant emperor irritated by unpaid tribute, but as a ruler who had conquered Constantinople and reshaped the balance of power in Eastern Europe. A man who viewed rebellious vassals not as equal adversaries but as obstacles to be removed. And thus the confrontation between Mehmed and Vlad was never a symmetrical duel, but a collision between imperial certainty and defiant autonomy. Vlad understood the imbalance of scale. He knew Wallachia could not meet the Ottoman army in open, sustained battle without catastrophic loss. And so he chose a strategy that reflected both his exposure to Ottoman military organization and his own evolving doctrine of psychological warfare. A strategy built upon mobility, scorched earth, and above all the manipulation of fear as weapon sharper than steel. As Ottoman forces advanced northward across the Danube, Vlad ordered villages burned, wells poisoned, crops destroyed, livestock driven away or slaughtered, transforming his own territory into hostile landscape that would starve and disorient invading troops, because he had learned in captivity that imperial armies, though disciplined, depended upon logistics, and disruption of supply lines could fracture even the strongest formations. Yet deprivation alone was insufficient to deter a sultan who commanded tens of thousands, and so Vlad escalated beyond attrition into spectacle, orchestrating raids under cover of darkness, striking swiftly at Ottoman camps, retreating into forests before counterattack could consolidate, and cultivating an atmosphere of constant unpredictability that eroded confidence. The most infamous of these operations occurred in June 1462, when Vlad launched a daring night attack upon Mehmed's encampment near Targovist, infiltrating enemy lines in disguise, attempting to assassinate the Sultan directly. And though he failed to kill Mehmed, the audacity of the assault demonstrated that Wallachia's prince would not hide behind walls while empire encroached. He would carry war into the heart of the invaders' confidence. The night attack did not annihilate the Ottoman army, yet it disrupted order and spread uncertainty, forcing Mehmed to confront a ruler who operated not according to conventional battlefield expectations, but according to psychological disruption. And as the Sultan advanced toward Targovist afterward, expecting resistance in traditional form, he encountered instead a landscape transformed into theater of horror. Outside the capital, stretching across fields like grotesque monument, stood what chroniclers later called the Forest of the Impaled. Thousands of bodies mounted upon stakes at varying heights, Ottoman soldiers and possibly local enemies displayed in deliberate arrangement, decomposing under summer sun, their silence communicating a message more visceral than proclamation could ever convey. The effect upon Mehmed's advancing troops was immediate and profound. Seasoned soldiers accustomed to war nevertheless recoiled at the sight, for impalement prolongs death in agonizing spectacle, and when multiplied into the thousands, it transforms punishment into environment, creating the sense that one marches not toward battle, but into domain governed by someone who recognizes no restraint. Accounts suggest that even Mehmed, hardened by conquest, paused upon seeing the field of impaled bodies, reportedly remarking that it would be difficult to deprive a man of his land when he has accomplished such deeds. Though whether apocryphal or authentic, the anecdote captures the psychological dimension of Vlad's strategy. He sought not merely to repel invasion physically, but to erode the invader's resolve through horror. Impalement in this context was not spontaneous cruelty. It was calculated communication, designed to replace numerical superiority with moral shock, to suggest that occupation of Wallachia would entail constant exposure to unpredictable brutality. and in a pre-modern era where rumor traveled faster than accurate intelligence, such displays amplified fear beyond immediate battlefield. Yet terror carries cost beyond enemy morale. It also shapes perception abroad, and as reports of the forest of the Impaled circulated through Transylvania and into German-speaking territories, pamphleteers seized upon them with fascination and revulsion, producing illustrated broadsheets depicting Vlad dining among impaled victims or boiling children, exaggerations layered upon kernels of truth, transforming local defensive brutality into international monstrosity. Within Wallachia, however, reactions were more nuanced. Some saw Vlad as defender who dared to confront overwhelming Ottoman might, while others endured his methods as necessary evil in precarious time, and thus his identity bifurcated, hero to some, tyrant to others, legend to many. Meanwhile, the Ottoman campaign did not collapse entirely. Radu, Vlad's brother, advanced with Ottoman backing, presenting alternative claimant more aligned with imperial interests, and as Mehmed withdrew strategically after assessing the logistical strain and psychological toll, Radu gained support among factions weary of constant devastation, illustrating the double-edged nature of Vlad's strategy. Terror deters enemies, but can alienate subjects exhausted by perpetual conflict. The forest of the Impaled achieved its immediate purpose of shocking the Ottoman advance, yet it also intensified the perception that Vlad ruled through spectacle of suffering, and in the calculus of power, perception often proves as decisive as battlefield outcome. For Vlad himself, the episode represented culmination of lessons learned in youth. That fear must be unmistakable, that enemies must hesitate before crossing borders, that dominance must be demonstrated rather than assumed, and in erecting that macabre forest he externalized the philosophy forged during hostagehood: never appear weak, never rely on mercy, never allow uncertainty to embolden opposition. Yet as the Ottoman threat receded temporarily and Radu consolidated support with imperial backing, Vlad's internal position weakened, because terror alone does not sustain alliances indefinitely, and the very methods that repelled Mehmed began isolating him diplomatically. By late 1462, pressure mounted from multiple fronts. Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, initially positioned as potential ally against Ottoman expansion, grew wary of Vlad's destabilizing tactics and perhaps tempted by political advantage, and through a combination of shifting alliances and questionable evidence, including forged letters suggesting Vlad's secret negotiations with the Ottomans, Matthias arrested him, transforming defender of Christendom into prisoner of former ally. Thus, the prince who had terrified a sultan now found himself captive not in Ottoman court, but within Hungarian custody, a reversal that underscored the volatility of his world and the fragility of rule sustained through fear alone. The forest of the Impaled remains one of history's most chilling images, yet beyond its horror lies deeper narrative, a ruler shaped by captivity and betrayal, employing terror as shield against annihilation, succeeding in the short term yet incurring long-term isolation that would cost him his throne. Fear can repel armies, but it cannot guarantee loyalty. And as Vlad's chains replaced his scepter, the lesson that power achieved through intimidation requires constant renewal confronted him once more, this time from within prison walls. When Vlad was arrested by King Matthias Corvinus in late 1462, The reversal must have felt almost cyclical, as though the pattern of his youth had reasserted itself with cruel symmetry, because once again he found himself confined not by declared enemies but by those whose support he had relied upon. And in that confinement the prince who had wielded terror as instrument of sovereignty was forced to confront the limits of fear when stripped of immediate authority. The circumstances of his arrest remain layered in political ambiguity, for Matthias, ruling Hungary and positioned as defender of Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, had initially benefited from Vlad's resistance to maimed II, yet continued open war with the Ottomans demanded resources and unity that Hungary could scarcely afford, and thus Vlad's unpredictability, combined with German merchant propaganda portraying him as destabilizing tyrant, offered Matthias convenient pretext to neutralize him without openly aligning with the Sultan. Forged letters allegedly demonstrating Vlad's secret negotiations with the Ottomans circulated as justification, though historians debate their authenticity, and regardless of their truth, the outcome remained the same. Vlad was imprisoned, first in relative confinement in Visegrad and later, perhaps, under looser house arrest, his fate dependent not on his own armies but on the shifting calculations of Hungarian policy. For a man whose identity had crystallized around decisive action and visible enforcement, imprisonment imposed a different kind of test, one not of battlefield courage but of internal endurance, because terror as strategy loses relevance behind stone walls, and the prince who had orchestrated spectacles of control now experienced life without immediate capacity to command. It is tempting to imagine Vlad pacing endlessly, rage simmering, yet captivity in this context was not necessarily dungeon-bound misery. Matthias appears to have kept him under conditions befitting a political asset rather than condemned criminal, perhaps even integrating him into courtly circles gradually, and during these years Vlad would have observed another model of governance, the Renaissance-tinged court of Hungary, where power balanced between chivalric display, political maneuvering, and cultural patronage. Time in captivity often reshapes ambition. It forces reflection not through philosophical inclination but through enforced stillness. And for Vlad, who had relied upon immediate and demonstrative punishment to secure loyalty, the distance from Wallachia may have allowed recalibration of methods because the world he left behind had not remained static. Radu governed with Ottoman backing, internal factions adjusted to new authority, and the memory of Vlad's severity began to transform into legend, amplified by printed pamphlets in German lands that depicted him as monstrous caricature, feasting among impaled bodies and reveling in cruelty. The invention of the printing press only a few years earlier ensured that these pamphlets spread rapidly, making Vlad one of the first rulers whose reputation was shaped by mass-produced propaganda. And while some of these stories contained elements of truth, others were exaggerated or entirely fabricated, designed to serve Saxon merchant interests or political agendas within Transylvania, and thus the captive prince watched as his image detached from his direct control, evolving into something both feared and distorted. There is irony in the fact that while Vlad once used spectacle to shape perception intentionally, he now became subject to spectacle shaped by others, his forest of impaled bodies transformed into woodcut illustrations consumed by audiences far removed from Wallachian realities. And in this transformation we glimpse early instance of how reputation can outlive context, hardening into myth independent of original intention. Years passed. Radu's rule, though initially stable under Ottoman auspices, faced its own pressures, for governing Wallachia meant constant negotiation with boyars and external powers regardless of alignment. And as Ottoman priorities shifted and Hungarian politics evolved, the possibility of Vlad's return began to re-emerge as strategic option rather than liability. Matthias, ever pragmatic, gradually repositioned Vlad not as prisoner but as potential ally once more, particularly as Ottoman influence required counterbalance, and by the early 1470s Vlad had been released from stricter confinement, even marrying into Hungarian nobility, integrating partially into the courtly structure that had once detained him. Captivity had not erased his ambition. It had tempered its immediate expression. He had witnessed once more how swiftly alliances invert, how fear without broad coalition can isolate, how propaganda can define a ruler beyond his borders, and perhaps these realizations influenced the strategy he would employ in his final attempt to reclaim Wallachia. In 1476, after years of political maneuvering and shifting support, Vlad returned once again to his homeland with Hungarian backing, reclaiming the throne briefly in a landscape altered by decades of warfare and intrigue. Yet this third reign would be short-lived, because the currents that had defined his life, Ottoman pressure, internal factionalism, external manipulation, had not vanished. They had merely reconfigured. His death later that year, likely in battle against Ottoman forces or rival claimants, ended his earthly rule not with theatrical final stand recorded in detail, but with abrupt cessation characteristic of the violent era he inhabited, his head reportedly sent to Constantinople as proof of his demise, a grim punctuation to life defined by confrontation. Yet even in death, his story refused containment. In Wallachia and parts of Eastern Europe, he lingered as complex figure, harsh yet resolute defender against Ottoman expansion. In German lands, he persisted as exemplar of cruelty. Centuries later, through the imagination of Bram Stoker, his name would fuse with vampire folklore, transforming historical prince into immortal predator, a metamorphosis that eclipsed nuance entirely and recast his brutality into supernatural myth. Captivity under Matthias thus stands as pivotal interlude, a pause between terror and legend, a period in which Vlad's agency contracted while his reputation expanded, and within that paradox lies enduring lesson. Power exercised visibly can shape immediate outcomes, but narrative constructed by others can shape eternity. The hostage prince had become impaling ruler, the impaling ruler had become captive, the captive had become legend. And as the final chapter approaches, what remains to examine is not only the man who wielded fear, but the myth that would outlive him, evolving far beyond Wallachia's borders into something darker and strangely immortal. By the time Vlad returned to Wallachia in 1476, he was no longer the young prince shaped by fresh trauma, nor the defiant ruler at the height of his calculated terror, but a man tempered by imprisonment, by propaganda, by the realization that fear alone could not secure lasting alliances. And yet he remained driven by the same uncompromising conviction that Wallachia must not dissolve quietly into imperial absorption, even if defending it demanded once more stepping into the storm that had defined his life. The political landscape awaiting him had shifted in subtle yet significant ways, because Radu, his brother and Ottoman-backed rival, had died earlier that year, leaving a vacuum in Wallachian leadership, and Hungary, seeking to counterbalance Ottoman influence in the region, saw advantage in reinstating Vlad as familiar and experienced claimant capable of resisting southern expansion. And thus, through convergence of necessity rather than reconciliation of ideology, Vlad reclaimed the throne for what would become his final reign. This return, however, lacked the dramatic consolidation of 1456. There was no extended purge of boyars, no grand spectacle announcing a new era, because the years of captivity had altered both Vlad and Wallachia, and the principality itself had grown weary of constant oscillation between rulers aligned with one empire or another, its people accustomed to instability as permanent condition rather than temporary crisis. Still, Vlad's instincts did not evaporate. He understood that reclaiming authority required swift assertion, that hesitation invites usurpation, and so he moved quickly to reinforce defenses, reassert control over key strongholds, and signal to both allies and enemies that his resolve remained intact. Yet time had eroded certain advantages. His previous campaigns had carved deep scars into regional memory, and while some admired his resistance to the Ottomans, others remembered the severity of his internal purges and may have hesitated to rally fully behind him once more. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, had not forgotten him, nor the forest of the Impaled that had shocked even seasoned soldiers years earlier. And although maimed II himself would die in 1481, the machinery of imperial ambition continued grinding forward, viewing Wallachia less as distant irritant and more as strategic necessity, controlling access to the Danube frontier. Thus, Vlad's final reign unfolded not as stable restoration, but as fragile reclamation under constant threat, and as Ottoman-supported forces maneuvered once more to reassert influence, the prince who had once terrorized invading armies found himself once again facing a coalition whose scale dwarfed his resources. Accounts of his death remain sparse and contested, which is fitting for a man whose life oscillated between documented brutality and mythic exaggeration. Most sources suggest he was killed in battle in late 1476, perhaps near Bucharest, his body lost in the chaos of skirmish, his head severed and sent to Constantinople as proof to the Sultan that the Impaler had finally fallen, displayed publicly as counterspectacle to the horrors he once arranged. There is something symbolically stark in that ending, the ruler who displayed enemies upon stakes becoming trophy himself, his severed head raised as reassurance that terror can be extinguished, that even those who cultivate fear cannot escape vulnerability to it. And yet such an ending also reinforces the cyclical brutality of the era, where sovereignty was fragile and mortality immediate. Unlike many medieval rulers whose deaths faded quietly into genealogical records, Vlad's demise did not dissolve his presence. Instead, it catalyzed the transition from historical figure to enduring legend, because by the time of his death his reputation had already escaped Wallachia's borders, carried in pamphlets, diplomatic correspondence, and oral tales that exaggerated, distorted, and sometimes vilified his actions beyond context. In Transylvania and German-speaking regions, he remained cautionary tale of cruelty. In parts of Romania, he persisted as stern defender against Ottoman encroachment. And centuries later, when Bram Stoker sought inspiration for a Gothic villain, the name Dracula, once signifying son of the dragon, became fused with vampiric immortality, transforming a 15th-century prince into supernatural predator feeding upon blood. The irony is profound. Vlad, who governed through fear of visible death, became symbol of deathlessness in fiction, his historical brutality recast as undead persistence, as though narrative itself granted him the immortality he never sought in literal form. And in this transformation we observe how myth selects fragments of reality and amplifies them into archetype. Yet stripping away exaggeration and supernatural overlay, what remains at the core of Vlad's life is neither caricature nor pure heroism, but a ruler shaped by hostagehood, betrayal, geopolitical compression, and the relentless pressure of existing between empires that tolerated weakness only briefly. And from that crucible he forged a philosophy of governance rooted in deterrence through terror, believing perhaps that if fear could be made large enough, it might compensate for numerical inferiority. Whether he was monster or misunderstood defender depends largely upon vantage point. To Ottoman chroniclers he was rebellious vassal. To German merchants he was destabilizing tyrant. To certain Romanian traditions he was protector of sovereignty. To modern audiences he is shadow behind vampire myth, and each perspective reveals more about the storyteller than about the man himself. His final return did not secure permanent independence for Wallachia, nor did it eradicate Ottoman influence permanently. Yet it demonstrated once more his refusal to fade quietly into exile, his insistence upon reclaiming authority even after imprisonment and defamation. And in that insistence we see continuity with the boy who resisted assimilation at the Ottoman court, the prince who chose domination over compromise. The ruler who believed that survival required unmistakable demonstration of consequence. He died as he had lived, entangled in conflict between larger powers, navigating alliances that shifted like sand, confronting forces that exceeded his principality's scale. And though his reigns were intermittent and often brief, the intensity with which he governed ensured that memory of him would not dissipate gently. History remembers many rulers for duration. Vlad is remembered for impact. His forests of impaled bodies, his night raids, his imprisonment and return, his transformation into Dracula all form composite image that resists simplification, because within it coexist trauma and calculation, cruelty and strategy, survival and spectacle. The prince born between empires did not escape their pressure, he embodied it. And in embodying it so vividly, he secured place not merely in regional history but in global imagination, where his name continues to evoke both fascination and dread centuries after his body fell upon a battlefield long reclaimed by Earth. Death did not quiet Vlad's presence, it altered its medium. When his head was carried south to Constantinople and displayed as proof that the rebellious prince had finally fallen, the Ottoman court may have considered the matter closed. Yet in the cities north of the Danube and across the German-speaking lands of Central Europe, something different was unfolding, because the printing press, that new and restless machine of reproduction, had already begun reshaping how power and cruelty were remembered. And Vlad became one of the first rulers in European history whose reputation was forged as much in ink as in blood. The German pamphlets that circulated during and after his reign were not neutral records. They were political instruments, produced largely by Saxon merchants of Transylvania who had clashed economically with Vlad over trade privileges and taxation. and in these woodcut illustrations and prose narratives he appeared not as embattled border prince but as sadistic tyrant, dining among impaled victims, boiling children alive, nailing turbans to envoys' heads with theatrical relish. Exaggerations layered upon documented severity until cruelty became caricature. Such pamphlets sold well. Horror attracts attention, and in an era when literacy was expanding and printed broadsheets traveled quickly along trade routes, Vlad's image detached from Wallachian context and embedded itself in popular imagination across regions that knew little of the geopolitical pressures that had shaped his decisions. To readers in Nuremberg or Vienna, he was not balancing Ottoman expansion or purging treacherous boyars. He was spectacle incarnate, proof that barbarity lurked beyond familiar borders. Yet even as German narratives darkened his image, Slavic and Romanian traditions preserved alternate memory, one that acknowledged his harshness yet framed it within resistance against Ottoman encroachment, emphasizing his defense of sovereignty and his enforcement of order in chaotic land. In these accounts, impalement remained brutal but purposeful, violence severe yet strategic, and Vlad emerged less as monster than as grim guardian, willing to do what gentler rulers could not. Thus, from the moment of his death, two Vlads began to exist simultaneously, the tyrant of Western pamphlets and the defender of Eastern ballads, and over time these versions intertwined, feeding upon one another, amplifying contradictions until the historical man receded behind accumulating. Centuries later, in the 19th century, as Gothic literature flourished and European fascination with the mysterious East intensified, Irish author Bram Stoker encountered the name Dracula while researching Transylvanian history, intrigued by its etymology and dark resonance. And though Stoker's vampire bore little resemblance to the 15th century voivode beyond the borrowed name and geographic setting, the fusion proved enduring. Binding Vlad's historical cruelty to supernatural immortality in cultural consciousness. The irony is almost poetic. Vlad, who never sought literal immortality and whose methods were grounded in mortal deterrence, became figure of eternal life in fiction, an undead aristocrat feeding upon blood, castle-bound and shadowed by bats, a creature of night whose fear no longer served political strategy but aesthetic horror. In that transformation, impalement faded into background detail while vampirism dominated imagination, yet the underlying theme persisted, power sustained through fear. Modern scholarship attempts to disentangle legend from evidence, parsing Ottoman chronicles, Hungarian records, German pamphlets, and Romanian oral traditions to reconstruct a portrait less sensational and more contextual, revealing a ruler undeniably brutal by contemporary standards, yet not uniquely so within a violent era, a prince whose punishments were extreme, but whose world offered few gentle alternatives for small states resisting imperial absorption. To evaluate Vlad solely through lens of cruelty is to ignore the structural pressures that incentivized severity. To romanticize him as pure defender is to overlook the suffering inflicted internally. The truth lies between, in recognition that power exercised on fault lines often becomes harsher than power exercised at centers of stability. The birth of the monster, then, was not single moment but gradual accumulation, captivity shaping worldview, betrayal intensifying distrust, impalement transforming deterrence into spectacle, pamphlets amplifying horror into narrative, and Gothic fiction transmuting narrative into archetype. Each layer moved him further from historical specificity and closer to symbolic abstraction. Today, tourists visit Bran Castle in Romania under the assumption that it was Dracula's home, though historical evidence linking Vlad directly to that fortress is tenuous at best. Merchandise bearing fanged caricatures circulates globally. Films and novels perpetuate the vampire myth, and somewhere beneath these commercialized shadows stands the memory of a prince who once navigated alliances between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, who once rode through forests calculating how best to deter invasion, whose cruelty emerged not from supernatural hunger but from human fear of annihilation. In the end, Vlad's greatest power may not have been terror inflicted during life but narrative endurance after death, because while his rule spanned intermittent years in a single principality, his legend has endured for centuries across continents, evolving beyond historical boundaries into cultural archetype of fear embodied. The boy born between empires became hostage prince, then impaling ruler, then captive ally, then fallen claimant, and finally mythic monster, each transformation shaped not only by his own actions but by how others interpreted and retold them. History rarely grants immortality to those who seek it gently. It often reserves lasting presence for those who disturb it profoundly. Vlad disturbed his world, and in doing so, he ensured that long after Wallachia's political struggles faded into academic study, his name would continue to echo, sometimes misunderstood, often exaggerated, yet undeniably persistent, as reminder that fear, once unleashed upon history, rarely vanishes completely. There is a peculiar kind of immortality that history sometimes grants, not the immortality of monuments or dynasties, not the immortality of unbroken political legacy, but the immortality of symbol, when a human life detaches from its historical frame and begins to function as archetype. And in the centuries following Vlad's death, that is precisely what occurred, because the Prince of Wallachia, once entangled in the practical brutalities of 15th century geopolitics, gradually dissolved into something larger, darker, and far more abstract than the man himself. The transformation did not happen instantly. It unfolded slowly across generations, as stories were retold, reshaped, embellished, translated, and absorbed into folklore that already brimmed with spirits, revenants, and creatures of the night. For Eastern European oral traditions contained long-standing beliefs in the restless dead, striga, and other vampiric entities, figures who returned from the grave to torment the living. And though Vlad himself was not originally cast as one of these beings, the thematic overlap between a ruler associated with bloodshed and a cultural imagination fascinated by blood-drinking specters proved fertile ground for eventual fusion. By the 19th century, Europe found itself enthralled by Gothic romanticism, by ruined castles and mysterious landscapes, by the tension between rational modernity and lingering superstition, and in this atmosphere Bram Stoker encountered the name Dracula, likely drawn from historical references to Vlad's father's affiliation with the Order of the Dragon, and recognized in it a resonance both ancient and ominous. He borrowed the name, stripped it of its specific political context, and attached it to a fictional Transylvanian count who embodied aristocratic decay and predatory immortality. Stoker's Dracula was not Vlad reborn, yet the name anchored the character in a historical echo, granting the vampire a veneer of authenticity that magnified his impact. And as the novel spread, followed by theatrical adaptations and eventually cinema, the fictional count eclipsed the voivode entirely in popular consciousness, so that for many, Vlad the Impaler became little more than footnote beneath fangs. Yet beneath the layers of fiction, the core psychological elements remained strangely intact, because Stoker's vampire, like the historical Vlad, wielded fear as instrument of control, operated within borderlands between worlds, embodied both aristocratic authority and existential threat, and though separated by centuries and imagination, the connective tissue between prince and monster lay in the shared motif of domination sustained through terror. Modern reinterpretations have alternately demonized and romanticized him, casting him as anti-hero, tragic figure, nationalist icon, or pure villain, each portrayal reflecting contemporary anxieties more than medieval reality. Because legends function as mirrors, they reveal what societies fear or admire in themselves. In Romania, Vlad's legacy occupies more complex space, sometimes celebrated as defender against Ottoman encroachment, sometimes acknowledged as severe ruler shaped by violent age, while tourism capitalizes upon Dracula mythology in ways that blend fact and fiction freely, inviting visitors to explore castles loosely associated with him, to purchase souvenirs bearing stylized dragons and bats, to experience curated darkness divorced from 15th century politics. And perhaps this is the final irony, that a ruler who governed through visible brutality to secure fragile autonomy has become commodity within global culture, his terror sanitized into entertainment, his impalements reduced to historical trivia, overshadowed by capes and coffins. Yet if one peels back the myth, returning to the boy born in Sayasora, to the hostage observing Ottoman discipline, to the prince confronting treacherous boyars, to the ruler standing before Mehmed's advancing army, one finds not supernatural predator but human shaped by compression between empires, responding to instability with extremity, believing that fear might compensate for numerical weakness. His life does not require embellishment to remain compelling, it requires context. He was neither demon from birth nor sainted patriot, but product of borderland where compromise risked erasure and weakness invited conquest. And within that crucible, he forged a rule that prioritized deterrence above compassion, order above mercy, spectacle above subtlety. History has preserved his name not because he ruled longest or conquered widest territories, but because his methods imprinted themselves so forcefully upon collective memory that they demanded retelling, and retelling, once begun, rarely remains faithful to original scale. Dracula, the immortal vampire, may never have existed in stone halls of Wallachia, yet the persistence of the name ensures that Vlad the historical prince is never entirely forgotten, even if misunderstood, and in that strange continuity lies testament to the power of narrative, to reshape, to exaggerate, to immortalize. If immortality is endurance beyond death, then Vlad achieved it inadvertently, not through alchemy or divine favor, but through the extremity of his actions and the adaptability of human storytelling, his identity evolving across centuries from political actor to Gothic icon. And so the series closes where it began, between worlds, between empire and principality, between history and myth, between man and monster. The boy born between empires did not escape their pressure. He became embodiment of it, and though his body fell in battle and his head was displayed as trophy, his name crossed borders more effectively than any army, surviving in pamphlets, chronicles, novels, films, and whispered tales. Fear was his chosen instrument. Memory became his unintended immortality.